If you don't know Ryan Bubinski, then you don't know what you're missing. You're going to get to know him now. He's an amazing person to try to very quickly summarize an opportunity. This is a skill set that we desperately lack here in Barcelona, for somebody to really set very quickly how to quantify a market and figure out how to segment it so you can make some money. Ryan, let's talk some numbers. Can you talk to us about the Edtech market in general and how do you cross-sect it so people get an understanding?
Sure, absolutely. So education is obviously a huge opportunity and perhaps the highest impact opportunity for future generations. In terms of actually break it down into revenue opportunities, you have to get more specific. So for Codecademy, we do online technical skills training. When you look at that market opportunity, you're already into the tens of billions a year in revenue if you include corporate as well as consumer education. One of the fastest growing sections, though, is online English tutoring. If you look at what's going on, particularly in the Chinese market now, 15 billion in revenue in 2017 just for teaching English to non-English speakers online, and that's growing at double-digit percentages year over year. So who's the target market? What are you teaching them, and how are you delivering the content is how I usually break it up.
You're based in New York, so you understand the American market, but you didn't limit yourself to that. You've actually spent a considerable amount of time educating yourself regarding what's going on around the world. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you've been doing recently and perhaps give us some highlights of what you've seen? Because this is a fantastic sector to be investing in, but if you really know how to I guess, place your bet, and this is what you've been doing for the last, I don't know how many months. If you can talk about this?
Sure. So I think most entrepreneurs, they hear from the very beginning, solve your own problem, which encourages you to look locally, right? If you're solving your own problem, you're going to be looking around you, you're going to be building for your own market. But the advantage of building a business online is that potentially you could access any market that has connection to the internet. And what's fantastic is through mobile proliferation, now the majority of the world is connected to the internet, and so opportunities are global. And I believe that any business that's going to reach true scale has to be built for an international market. So you have to figure out what's going on. And some of the most interesting developments, particularly within education right now, are going on in Asian countries, Asia and Southeast Asia. And what's so unique about what they're doing there is they're leapfrogging a lot of the traditional educational infrastructure that exists in the developed economies. They're going straight to digital curriculum delivered through mobile experience that very quickly segments the audience based on their skill level, their interests, and also who their friends are. And they take that educational experience, customize it based on all sorts of parameters, and then connect learners to offline opportunities where you can deliver really high quality, high touch, personalized tutoring.
And you went around to different countries in Asia and Africa and different places, and you talked about, you learned how they were doing business there, how they're delivering the information, but can you talk to us about also percentage-wise, what does this mean to the rest of the world to put us in perspective? The US spends 1.5% of the federal budget on education. Talk to us about China and Indonesia.
Sure. So we were talking about some of the, what's the market opportunity and how do you think about how different cultures value education differently, or at least have different expectations about who's going to pay for education, right? Obviously. And so in the US, the majority of spend on education, if you exclude tertiary or university, it's government spending. Only about 1.5% of household income is spent on education at that level, out of pocket. So the majority is coming from cities, states, and federal budget. But that total number is about 20,000 per student per year, which is second in the world only to Luxembourg, which I think is this incredible statistic. But when you look at actual impact, the US scores very squarely in the middle of the 35 countries participating in the OECD surveys. And so when you look at in these markets across Asia, they don't have the luxury of that kind of federal budget. And so you see much higher out-of-pocket spend, whereas in the kind of middle and upper middle class, emerging middle class in China, you'll see as high as 10% of discretionary income spent on education. And so the majority of this is going to K through 12 tutoring services delivered online, either for English tutoring or test prep. And that's where I was pulling out the 15 billion in revenue number that we discussed earlier. In other, China's one market, of course, but the most interesting example that I saw of just leapfrogging over, in the absence of an existing educational infrastructure, or perhaps a dated educational infrastructure, is in Myanmar. There's a company I met actually while in Hong Kong at an Edtech conference. The name of the company is 360 Ed. And they basically inherited this Soviet-era education system where all students were given photocopied paper books of government-mandated curriculum, all in English, have you? And so that's what they're competing against, right? And so there's no technical education infrastructure. They have a very well-established electrical engineering curriculum in Myanmar, but they don't have a robust, pervasive computer science or programming curriculum. And so this company, 360 Ed, is building a digital education product in Myanmar. They need to hire software developers. Like, they don't have a Google or a large corporate employer like IBM that they can hire from. They have to create an entire ecosystem to hire from and build their company on. And so they've actually coupled programmer boot camps, kind of like what you'd see here with IronHack, or in the US, we have Dev Bootcamp, Hack Reactor, and what have you. They actually built their own developer boot camp to take electrical engineers graduating from university, upskill them, and at every level couple students with either internship opportunities or freelancer opportunities at competitive wages for Yangon, but which is to say not very much. But by the time these students got to 1 year, 1.5 years into the program, they were ready for full-time jobs as software developers. And so this company is now, it sounds impressive, the largest employer of programming talent in the country of Myanmar, and they've hired about 50 software engineers. So there's nothing, but they're creating something out of nothing, and that's really incredible, because you look at so many companies who say, okay, we can't hire talent, it's just too competitive, what are we going to do? And here's, in a very different context, an example of a company which has very little going for it in its favor, but is still able to build a competitive digital product that competes on the global stage. So that was another fascinating example. But.
And if you take what you just said, here in Spain, we're very proud of having a really cool quality of life. We have great talent, we keep telling ourselves, versus the cost. And we are well situated with a good infrastructure to grow. But how does a local player that has to pay these salaries, even in Spain, how is it going to compete in the long run with economies that are basically a lot cheaper and also have extremely high rates of internet penetration? Myanmar, South Korea is even more. And is this something that you can talk about, the implications of EdTech trends?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on the type of business that you want to build. But if you want to, I think something that we touched on earlier today in terms of if you're going to seek venture financing, what are the expectations that come with that? And what level of ambition should you match with your company if you seek to fund it with venture capital? You're going to be competing on a global scale with your product, and so you're going to need to also build a global team to build that product. And how you're going to source talent has to be competitive with the rest of the world. And so what's very interesting to me is how you can take a local regional advantage. If you look at what does Barcelona do so well, what culture do you have, or what particular unique insight for building product, how can you keep that here, but at the same time build a remote or distributed team around the world that's able to take advantage of this incredible talent pool that's being built, that's highly educated in English, has the technical skill set, is very hungry, and is looking for global opportunities and is willing to work as hard as they can to get access to those opportunities. And so, to me, the future is a blend, of course. It's not just an in-person team within one country or city or jurisdiction, but instead this incredible distributed team that's able to play to each region's advantage for the right talent at the right time in the company's history.
There's a common theme about digital literacy saving economies. How do you feel about this platitude, I guess?
I think that's just table stakes at this point, right? So at the moment, who knows what the future will bring, but English literacy is critical for participating in a global economy. And then on top of that, a digital skill set gives you access to higher paying jobs than you otherwise wouldn't have access to. And the majority of these jobs can be done remotely, or we're seeing more and more companies change how they do business in order to accept that talent into their organization or work with contractors. And so if you want your citizen base, to basically have access to this economy, they need to be able to participate in those workplaces. So they need to speak English, or at least be able to write and read English, and they need to have some technical skill set. And the more that they can specialize in a technical skill set, the higher the wages they can demand. But we're already seeing that programming is now mandatory education for the majority of G8 countries. If you look at the UK, Japan, France, Germany, and then to add on to that, Canada and China now by 2020 will have all incorporated programming at some level into their K through 12 core curriculum. And so you're going to get an entire generation, at this point, about 500 million students each year who are being exposed to programming as a concept. And so that's what I meant by it. It's basically table stakes.
If you take, what is the average hours that a South Korean kid is in school, and how much of that is dedicated to education?
So I don't know that. I know, roughly the amount of time that's spent on preparation work outside of the classroom. I think classroom time across most developed or developing economies is pretty equivalent, but in the US it's an average number of something like 20. In South Korea, I think it's at least 30. It's very common for students in South Korea to have 3 schools they go to. They have their regular, government classroom work. Then they have their private test prep session in the afternoon. And then they'll have a private tutor on the weekends to help them close the gaps for the test prep sessions that they've missed. It's insanely competitive. Compared to, I think, Germany is something like an average of 10. And so that's not to say that that's a great proxy, right? It's very important to say, what are we actually measuring for here? So I think that's probably a better example of how by taking shortcuts in the goals that we set or in the way in we test for talent, you can perhaps, in a very harmful way, get a lot of people to spend a lot of time doing something that's not yielding a great result, which is mastering tests. And then once you take the test, what are you going to do with all that work?
Well,
one of the drain.
In terms of basically the concern of arbitraging talent across different trading blocks or countries, is there a trend that you might see that would help a local player in Spain that wants to jump into the Edtech segment? How can they compete that way then?
Yeah, so I mean, this is getting back to our earlier point, right? If you want to build an internet company that competes on a global scale, you first have to understand many markets. And I think it's very important that entrepreneurs design from the beginning a business model that will be inherently global. That doesn't mean that you need to take over, the entire global market opportunity, but you need to play in multiple markets simultaneously. And so to adopt that, just by adopting that mindset, you're going to look for opportunities either to arbitrage talent, as we were discussing earlier, or to look at ways to bring something that is a regional advantage to another market that would love to consume. And so just to be more globally minded is a huge advantage. Because at the end of the day, you're building a business, you need to reach customers, and you need to have enough customers that are going to be able to support your ambitions. And you may not have enough local customers for a consumer product locally.
Is there something that, big mistakes or common mistakes that you've seen during your travels in terms of being able for a country to develop its own edtech incentives or any kind of plans that you think are basically made? Because, sorry.
Yeah, there's a few stories here. So I think if we kind of look back at the last 5 years, right, this whole digital literacy movement, a lot of people got swept up in that message without thinking through the implications of what does that mean, how are we going to deliver on that promise. And so I would see, for some efforts, there'd be a mandate, of course, but it would be an unfunded mandate.
Right.
So teachers get squeezed in the middle here because they're getting evaluated by student performance metrics for a curriculum which they haven't been provided by the government, they haven't been trained by the government, they don't have the resources to set them up for success. And so it's very important to think about all parts of the ecosystem, right? So where do we, from an economic development perspective, where do we want to be in 5, 10, 20 years? What skill set is going to be necessary? How are we going to get there over time in a responsible, well thought out way? So setting the right timeline. I've seen countries rush this. They'll say, oh, in the span of 2 years, we're going to introduce programming at 3 different levels for 50 million students. I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, what are they going to learn? Who's going to teach them? How are they going to learn? And so, and then of course, how are we going to resource this, right? What combination of private and public resources are going to be put to bear on to solve the problem?
And if you have to go through moonshot thinking versus incremental improvements, we were talking about starting a blank canvas in Myanmar or I don't know, a smaller country that doesn't have the infrastructure built up. Have you had the ability to see what it's like up front with no teachers, no established?
So not inheriting that inertia is a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because, well, you don't have any infrastructure for you have a very dated educational infrastructure that you're inheriting, which is better than nothing, but certainly not competitive.
But you're a big proponent of like innovation and experimentation.
So it's interesting to see what happens in markets such as Myanmar when you don't have that inertia and you have a complete willingness to experiment and try new things, but that's a luxury that most developed economies don't have. And so I'm very interested in how can you at least create some blend, right, of an existing educational infrastructure, which needs to exist, but figure out how to experiment with new concepts, new ways of teaching to create a competitive edge for the labor force of the coming decades. And in terms of how to do that, it's very exciting to me now to see this explosion of private enterprise experimentation. Right? If you look at just how many educational efforts are out there around the world, it's very hard as a consumer to sort through them, right? Because education is not a try before you buy product. It's not a product that you really get to experiment with before fully committing in most cases. Like when you think about applying to a university or picking a school for your child, you don't want to keep, switching schools every year. It's either not possible or you're just going to be starting over repeatedly, or it's not really a great experience. But there's so many offerings out there, which is very exciting to see, because that means that students now are, using WhatsApp to talk to their teachers, to talk to each other. They're digitally connected. If they can then connect to digital education resources, hopefully you get this wonderful benefit of just-in-time learning, meaning whatever concept you need to learn, you can find the right resource for that concept in that moment, teach yourself, get what you want out of it, and then move on. And so we're seeing this very organic experimentation process. I'm happy to see that it's organic and not mandated from the top down, because I think it's too complex to mandate. So this blend is the future, and one that I'm very excited to see.
Well, as we discover and experiment with new pedagogical methodologies, hopefully you can continue to have success and share your wisdom as we move forward with the innovative models, and bring you back to Barcelona, and hopefully you can enjoy more of your tapas and the beers, and share stuff here with us at another Startup Grind event.
It's a lovely city, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you very much for coming to Barcelona. Welcome. And I guess with that, I think we're wrapping up. So thank you very much, Ryan.
Great, thank you.
And